All right. Good morning. I guess early afternoon as well for some folks. And welcome to the online portion of OTESSA. So it's an honor to be here with you and get things kicked off for us with our online stretch of days here. I am going to talk about something that let's see how the conversation goes. I have been really hoping that we can start to have a conversation in the field about what are some of the major problems that we really want to focus on and how it is that, to use American football analogy, how we want to move the ball down the field on these. So I'm going to focus on grand challenges and how that might lead us to develop a strategic plan for research and practice in the field. Drawing, first of all, here, this is an image from, actually, we took this picture for our book on ethics and ed tech. Because I like this idea of cracking jawbreakers. A lot of the problems that we're working on are not very easy problems to work on. And we found this really cool, massive jawbreaker. You can tell it's got this very retro coloring to it. And my co-authors, her husband, cracked it open and had to saw it in half and stuff. And I feel like that really represents a lot of the challenging problems that we work on here. So I'm going to use this idea of jawbreakers as we go throughout as well. Okay, so I think a major theme of grand challenges is focusing on problems and people, not things. Reeves and Reeves in 2015 argued that instructional design and technology has focused for far too long on things instead of problems. I think we can see this exemplified today, like in our discourse on AI. Anytime there's a new technology, we tend to get really focused on the technology itself. How do we teach people how to use the technology? And we're not really thinking about what are the problems that we're solving. So Tom Reeves in particular for quite a while has been saying, we really need to reorient what we're focused on as a field, and as a result of that, how we're organizing our efforts, our research efforts, our development efforts, everything. It's a very different way of thinking about the field and the work that we do. And he authored a piece with Lynn somewhat more recently where they said ed tech research does not have a distinguished record in dealing with local educational problems, much less global ones. That's a piece that's titled "The Research We Have Is Not the Research We Need." And I think that this is an important place to start with, of inviting us to think about what research we have and what research we actually need. Now, Tom has, in the meantime, developed, of course, educational design research methods and tried to advance those sorts of methods where we're doing a lot more participatory design work, a lot more working with and designing with, not designing for or at. And so this is a real shift in how we think about things. In fact, one of the more recent handbooks in research in educational technology, they tried to reorient around this focus on problems instead of things. And when they were sharing about that in a session later, they said, it was actually really hard to get authors to propose topics and write for that, because so many researchers in particular tend to think of, my expertise is in online learning, or my expertise is in gaming or adaptive learning systems or open technology or something like that. So we tend to be very heavily oriented around technology in our discourse, in the work that we do, in our identities, even though it may seem like a simple statement on paper, reframe from things to problems. That's actually quite a tricky challenge to start to pull off. But I think that's what grand challenges can help us do. So grand challenges are major complex problems in a field that should be solvable within a generation or two. That's quite a time horizon, first of all. Generation is usually about 20 years or so. So we're talking about a 20 to 40-year time horizon on the work. And that would have great societal and economic impact depending on how they are addressed or left unaddressed. George and colleagues define global problems as problems that can be plausibly addressed through coordinated and collaborative effort. And I'm sure we might take issue with the word solvable here. Like I said, what are problems where we can at least move the ball down the field and have some sort of measurable or visible or noticeable impact on whatever problem it is that we're tackling? So I think there's an inherent discussion underneath this idea of grand challenges, and that's how we define progress. And I think this is a theme, again, that's coming out quite a bit in the discussion on AI. It always comes up around a lot of technologies. So Leo Marx explored the question of, does improved technology mean progress? And he walked through different historical periods in the US to explore how definitions and concepts of progress changed as technology became an increasing presence in work and daily lives. Enlightenment era discourse on progress tended to emphasize improvement in life conditions, social, political, moral, intellectual, and material. And progress was sort of bound up with the notion of the struggle for freedom from monarchical or aristocratic hierarchies. And this was captured in part by Thomas Jefferson saying about science that science had liberated the ideas of those who read and reflect. An insurrection has consequently begun of science, talents, and courage against rank and birth. And so science is progressive, he proclaimed. So we have this initial idea of progress as social or political. However, as Marx notes, over time, the economic and political structure that emerged in the US and elsewhere was that of industrial capitalism, and different ideas about what constituted progress took shape. So Marx describes it as a detachment of technological advancement from the idea of social and political liberation. And during this time, Daniel Webster, which is a name you probably recognize, that's the Daniel Webster of Webster's Dictionary, he exemplified this sort of shift from progress as social or political to progress as technological, and also exerted a major rhetorical influence on technological progress as the US and other countries' mental imagination of technology, that progress became associated with technological progress. He was really enamored with the development of the railroads here in the US and industrial manufacturing, and began to speak of both with this sort of language of inevitability, of what Marx describes as the language of the technological sublime. And so through this rhetorical shift, technological innovation and advancement becomes the cause or the end itself, rather than as a means towards improved social and political ends. And this view of scientific and technological innovation is the very definition of progress that represents a technocratic view of progress, right? And an orientation around technologies. Values that tend to be associated with progress as technological include scale, efficiency, standardization, and the ability to engineer and optimize work and other human pursuits, such as learning. So Marx observed that the vision of knowledge and advances of empowering humankind did not actually disappear, but instead started to find home in critics like philosophers such as Kant and poets like Wordsworth of these mechanistic views of progress. Thomas Carlyle argued that mechanistic thinking and actual machinery reflected potential progress, but did not guarantee it. And Thoreau described the progress of the railroad into nature as improved means towards unimproved ends. The end result was not so much a shift back to social progress as a dominant view, but rather a tension between these two as competing views of progress and as a cascading implications for work and daily life in the future, depending on what is foregrounded and backgrounded in a given operant definition of progress. Now, of course, today we also have a particular category of technologies that we all tend to work with and work on. And those are educational technologies. And these introduce sort of a third way that we can think about progress. So progress as improved learning or improvement to educational systems or processes. On Friday, I'm actually going to be doing a presentation with one of our doc students here, where we analyze the rhetorical discourse of teachers talking about technology related to progress. And overwhelmingly, when teachers talk about how they conceive of progress related to technology, they will mention improved learning and improved educational systems. In other words, does this really benefit my students? Does this actually help them learn? And that's their conception of progress. So as we talk about grand challenges, part of what we're really discussing underneath this is this implicit conversation about how do we define progress and how are we reframing progress. And we can use this grand challenges as a way to very proactively reframe what it is that we mean by progress. I'm going to give you some examples of what other fields have done, because instructional design and technology is not had a discourse about grand challenges before, but other fields use this to organize their research and development and practice efforts. And it also heavily drives funding priorities and initiatives in their fields as well. Engineering is probably one of the most visible ones. The National Academy of Engineering, or NAE, has organized and convened meetings and groups for a very long time to talk about what are the grand challenges in the field. If you look up engineering grand challenges, it will take you right to this website where you can see what they have identified as their grand challenges in the field. I've got those listed over here. And what's interesting is they also identified 4 themes across these grand challenges. Those are themes of sustainability, health, security, and joy of living. So these are sort of the overarching themes that sit on top of many of these, at least according to participants of NAE. We might disagree whether some of these really represent that, but we were not part of that discourse. So you can see here some of their goals. These are very specific goals that, like I said, these drive funding and investment in research. These drive collaborations and partnerships with different entities. And those entities are not just universities and researchers, but in a lot of cases, maybe these are researchers or folks at institutions working with nonprofits or governmental organizations or non-government organizations. So these heavily drive what folks do, how they collaborate, who they collaborate with. Having been a part of NSF, National Science Foundation proposals here, these come up time and again. How does your work tie back to these grand challenges? So the act of going through this whole process, they put out a report, and you can see it here. They maintain this website. Like, this is very heavily funded. This act is intended to drive national research funding and development efforts. I'll give you a moment to kind of check through this list of 14 goals. It's over here, advancing personalized learning, which is interesting that engineering decided that that was something they wanted to take on. Reverse engineer the brain. That's an interesting one. Of course, they've also got challenges like making solar energy more economical, providing access to clean water, providing energy from fusion. And there are large coordinated research and development efforts taking place around all of these goals at this time. I think in engineering, we can see some desire towards defining progress as social. That's embedded in here. But you can also see a lot of technological progress, right? This is definitely a technology-heavy field. And so a number of their goals are really focused on, again, advancing better health informatics, enhancing virtual reality. These are very technological definitions, where some of these are more social aspects of what is the progress that they want to see and what is the work that they think their field can do towards that. I want to shift gears a little bit to one that might feel a little bit closer to home for us, although I think engineering as a design and technology field, we share a lot in common with them. But let's take a look at grand challenges for social work. So the social work discipline similarly held several meetings. These are events where folks come together, talk about what might be grand challenges, and identify what they think are the priorities. And got the link in here for you. Again, you can search for grand challenges, social work, and you'll find this website if you want to explore it more. But these are what they have listed for their grand challenges for social work. And they've clustered them into some different themes of individual and family well-being, stronger social fabric, and a just society. Now, some of these are very bold grand challenges that they've adopted. For example, eliminating racism or ending homelessness. Now, we could certainly, as we go, talk about how bold would we want to be in the grand challenges that we identify. I tend to love these. There's this great quote from Robert Browning and Fra Lippo Lippi, where the character says, "A man's reach must exceed his grasp," or "what's a heaven for?" And I think these really represent a field that is saying, we may not truly eliminate racism, we may not end homelessness or eradicate social isolation, right? Those are moving the dial to zero on those things. But if we set our aims really high, we'll probably get a lot further than we would have if we had set them in a much more reasonable goal. So kind of like the spirit, what they're conveying here in their grand challenges. So if you take a look at each under the specifics where they've categorized these, you can see like under individual and family well-being, they talk about ensuring healthy development for youth, closing the health gap, advancing long and productive lives, for stronger social fabric, of course, addressing homelessness, social isolation, harnessing technology for social good. That sounds more like a means and an objective, but preventing gun violence, of course, here in the US, very huge challenge. And then under just society, how can we eliminate racism? How can we promote smart decarceration? And I think you can see in this a mix of some shared objectives. I think when I look at the OTESSA program, I see some similar themes across here. But then there's also some places where you can see, okay, this is very specific to the work that social work as a field engages in. So I'm going to talk about a few things that I think would be grand challenges for us in the field as a way to start generating some examples and hopefully get you thinking about, because in a moment, I'm going to have us do an activity as a group and talk about what we think are the grand challenges. So I'm going to talk through some that I would propose as grand challenges for our field. First one that I would propose is increasing adult literacy rates. I think for anybody who knows me and my work, that's probably not a surprising one for me to list. I started doing work with the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy several years ago, and honestly had not stopped to think about this particular problem. But this is a substantial problem, both in the US and globally, and I think it's something that we can do something about. And then the second one that I would propose is improving online learner mental health. And I'll get into that one in a little bit to talk through how I've come to focus on that. Like I said, with adult literacy, this is a substantial problem in the US and globally. In the US alone, there's an international test. It's called the PIAAC, P-I-A-A-C, that measures adult literacy. And this test is administered globally, so you can compare literacy rates across different countries and we can see trends and things like that. In the US alone, so level 3 is considered literate, and that means that somebody not just can read, but can read multiple sources and can make meaning of what they're reading across multiple sources of information. So that might be like the ability to read 2 or 3 articles in the news and be able to say, oh, well, over here they report X and over here they report Y, and what sense am I going to make of maybe, similar information and conflicting information? That would be level 3 literacy on the PIAAC. In the US, 52% of adults score below level 3. What that means, and I'll break this down just real quickly, 33% of adults score at level 2, which means they can read the words on a page, right, or on the screen, but they have a lot of difficulty making sense across multiple sources of information. So they might be able to read an article or a quick excerpt or something and understand that. But as soon as they start trying to read across multiple sources, they have difficulty crosswalking sources and making meaning across those. Another 19% of US adults are level 1 or lower. Level 1 means that they actually have difficulty reading. That may mean that they're having difficulty with syntax and structure, or it may even mean more basic literacy issues like phonemes and words and being able to decode. If those numbers sound shockingly high to you, then that's my point in sharing them with you, that this is a substantial problem. So that's about 43 million adults here in the US who struggle with reading and making sense of written information, regardless of whether that's written on paper or on screen. Globally, the estimates from UNESCO are that about 1 billion people globally fall into that low literacy, that level 1 category. And this mostly affects women and minorities. So this is a truly globally shared problem. Additionally, there is extremely limited research and funding for developing interventions and resources. Part of the work I did with the foundation was to do a survey of the research and what's known. And we looked at, in the last 10 years, there's only been 21 research papers, period, published on this. Now, if you look at like K-12 literacy, That's a very different thing. Lots of money gets poured into that, lots of research on that, lots of research on the technology. But when we look at adult literacy, the funding for programs, the funding for the research is all extremely limited. So like here in New Mexico is highest poverty state in the United States. We have an annual budget at the state level of about $900,000 for all adult literacy programs across the state. And our literacy challenges here are higher than the rest of the US as well. So this is a place where we could have a lot more research. It would be great to have like a network of researchers. We also just need help developing actual effective interventions and resources to support the work that's being done out in the field. So it's a very practical element and need here as well. So this is both a learning problem and a societal problem where leveraging technologies might be able to play a role. And of course, this influences other problems such as misinformation, disinformation. There's also a strong connection between reading literacy and other types of literacy, like health literacy. If individuals struggle, for example, to read a prescription or read what the directions on a bottle of medication, then you have a lot of instances where individuals don't take their medication properly. And of course, that has immediate health impacts for them. To my mind, this is a significant challenge, and I'd love to work with a team of people around the world, right, trying to tackle this sort of problem. We shift to improving online learner mental health as another example. And also, if we work on adult literacy, it can have a substantial economic and quality of life impact. So online learner mental health. Actually, let me give you a little context for this. During the pandemic, a lot of folks, provosts, whatnot, started making claims about how online learning negatively impacts student mental health. And I made a comment on Twitter about, I have never seen that in the research. Online learning has been studied for over 20 years. Never seen that as a theme come up in the research. And when I posted that, Michael Barber and George Valencianos reached out and they were like, you know what, let's do a review of literature because it'd be interesting to really see, like, is there any evidentiary basis for this? And if so, or if not, like, what's the point of that? So we actually published a paper on that in OTESSA journal. In reading through what does exist on that, first of all, there is no causal relationship, just to set that aside. But second of all, what we routinely found was in all of these articles that claim that online learning impacted student mental health, they start off with, like any good paper, with their lit reviews. And in their lit reviews, they kept citing research that showed this declining state of learner mental health over several years, like many years. And it became clear as we were reading paper after paper that there's a substantial trend here over student mental health. Now I'm framing this in terms of online learning because a lot of us work in like online or blended contexts. But I think we can also say, this is a broader trend than that too. What we also started to see in some studies that were actually well designed, there was a lot of bad research, and I see Valerie, thank you, put a link to that, and we talk about the bad research in that paper. But in the studies that were really well designed, what they highlight is that many of the interventions at work are instructional and structural in nature. For example, looking at class workload and expectations. I don't think that's a new statement to any of us here that maybe an instructor's class workload and expectations are really out of whack. And that's causing a lot of stress for students. Having flexible policies and having infrastructure and resources in place to support students as those sort of structural interventions. There's a lot of things that we can design and develop and test to help address this. Right now, though, again, there's very limited research. What research is out there, when we did our survey, every study except for one was conducted during the pandemic. Most of those failed to control for the pandemic as a variable in that. But there's some folks, like there's a doc student down at Texas Tech, Fatima, she and I are getting ready to put out a piece on this. She's doing some research around online learner mental health in particular, and finding that there's a significant need, especially now. Maybe the pandemic played a role. There's also other things that are feeding into this that contribute where we can do a better job supporting our students. And so, especially in online environments, we can leverage these online environments, whether it's for online learners or for every other learner, to build in better supports for learner mental health. Online learning systems are often under-resourced, of course, compared to on-campus. If I think of a campus as a learning ecosystem, it's not just the classes, right? But there's all these other things that we build around students to help support them and make them successful, like career services, the library, tutoring, writing centers, all kinds of things that we do to support on-campus students. We don't tend to design for online learning in the same way. And I know many of us are trying to move that ball down the field. And so how might we encourage this idea of online learning ecosystems where we're thinking about our learners much more holistically and how we design and support them through that? And of course, online solutions are very flexible and can support and benefit all learners. In some case studies on institutions where they did build out programs, they mainly leveraged like mobile technologies or online technologies, and found that even though they might have been oriented towards their online learners or blended learners in particular, that all of their students in their ecosphere took advantage of those resources. So I hope that starts to get some ideas churning, right, about what are grand challenges and what do these look like? And by no means am I trying to shoehorn us into these two, but I thought giving you some examples of what these might look like in our field would be really helpful, especially as these start to help highlight how these are both social problems as well as learning problems. And what that means is we as a field, we as professionals are well situated to bring our methods, our principles, our practices to serve or to bear on these problems. So one thing I want to call out is grand challenges are strategic objectives. And starting to have some conversations with folks around this. I noticed that what was coming up were more like topics. And if we go back and we take a look at, especially like the grand challenges one, I think you can start to see how these are really articulated as objectives, not as topics. So note how they're articulated as objectives, not just a list of items or topics, or my favorite thing to focus on. We as professionals are supposedly pretty good at writing objectives. So I think that we should be able to do a pretty good job at this. So let's put our methods and practices to some greater use and start cracking some jawbreakers here. I'm going to end on this and then shift into an activity for us to do together. There's this article that Dale Breathauer wrote back in 2007 called Yes, We Can, a rejoinder to Don Winnicke's rejoinder about saving the world with HPT. This article's always kind of cracked me up. It started off as this conversation about saving the world. My advisor was Roger Kaufman, and Roger's strategic planning model is, he calls it mega planning, but it's really oriented around social impact. How do we design and plan for the desired social impact that we want to have? So Roger had written a piece on this, and Don Winnicke had replied that, look, it's not our job to save the world. That's not what we do. We're researchers, and as researchers, we do, blah, 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 blah. And Dale responded to Don saying, yes, we can. And I like that title, and I like the sentiment in Dale's article. And for those who don't know, HPT is Human Performance Technology. It's sort of an organizational or corporate offshoot of instructional design and technology. It takes sort of a systems lens to everything. So Dale says, I would rather be involved in saving the world than destroying it. Everything I do contributes in a small way to one or the other, to saving the world or destroying it. I can help save the world by functioning as a human performance technology professional. I'm not qualified to help as a farmer, construction worker, mathematician, physicist, chemist, social worker. I make my contribution to saving the world by applying methods, principles, and concepts from HPT. I think to me, this is in essence what we're saying around global challenges, right? We're saying, yes, we can. It's not enough to identify that there are challenges and that they exist, but rather this is us saying, this is how we want to put our shoulder to that plow and how we can apply our methods and principles and our concepts from our profession. When I read through the OTESSA program, I feel like it radiates this message. That's one of the reasons I love OTESSA, and I really love the conference and the presentations that are going on. There are not simple answers to these questions, but I look through the program and I see a lot of folks identifying significant problems and needs and trying to devise solutions or research that and understand it better and trying to move that ball down the field. So I feel like OTESSA is a great place for starting this particular conversation. So with that, I want us to now talk about, we haven't had a Grand Challenges initiative to date. And so I'm proposing that we have a Grand Challenges initiative that would help us make this shift and help us coordinate our efforts and make a difference in substantive ways. So now I'm going to turn the question to you, to us collectively. What are the major social, technological, and learning problems before us where we want to make progress, hopefully phrased in the form of an objective? And what does that progress look like to us? Put this back down here. My goal for the rest of our time right now, and hopefully gets us thinking about this for not just today, not just this hour, but going forward. Right now, I want to generate some preliminary ideas, identify opportunities for coordination and collaboration, and maybe even identify some possible outputs from today and next steps. So I really want to hear from you on this. So we're going to do a breakout room activity in small groups. I'm going to put us into probably about 4 or 5 groups and discuss. I want you to generate a list of the major social, technological, and learning problems. And then I want you to think through how these might be addressed through research and how these might be addressed through practice. And I've got a Google Doc for us to do that. And then let me stop my sharing. I'm going to put us into breakout rooms real quick. You'll see that I've broken it down to like group 1, group 2, group 3, yada, yada. So whatever group you're in, put your stuff under there. We're going to take about 15 minutes to do this. Here we go. All right, as we bring folks back in, I'm going to wrap up with, you've got the link to the Google Doc, so you should be able to scroll back through and see what other groups generated. So take just a hot minute to go back through and take a look and see what other folks were talking about. I would say I was not at all surprised by where the conversations went. Again, having looked at the OTESSA program and the conversations over the past several years in this organization, I think some of the themes are pretty predictable and folks are really very committed to working on certain challenges and problems. And I think I've been thinking through that very thoughtfully about how do we do that. When I was in with the third group, I started in listening to them. I started thinking, one of the shared challenges that we also have is that research to policy connection, whether that's institutional or, on up the chain or whatnot. So that might be something that we want to consider as well. Just very quickly, as a way to gauge interest, if you can, as you take a few minutes to read through, also indicate ones that you think should be a grand challenge. And you can do that when you go back into that Google Doc. If you just highlight something, and then there's the add emoji. If you could just add an emoji to the ones where you're like, yeah, I'm really on board with this. And I think that this would be a great time and place to put our effort. I listed some of the ones up at the top that I proposed, but the groups have really generated a lot of really great ideas. So I think take a moment to go through there, and that this will be sort of our process of starting to identify what we think are things that we might want to organize around and try to have some coordinated efforts on, and maybe even connect with other folks and say, okay, hey, who else is working on digital literacy and access? Keith, it was so fantastic to learn about your work and the context that you're working in today. So if you go through and start doing that, and we'll get a sense of where folks feel we might have some concentrations of energy, that would be great. And then as we wrap up, I want you to be thinking about, what appear to be some opportunities for coordination and collaboration. what might you like to see as a possible output from today? So certainly feel free to email me or Valerie, and we can put our shoulders to that plow for you. And then what would you like to propose as possible next steps? Like, I, of course, would love to see this as an ongoing conversation and have folks come back together and say, for example, hey, here's what we're doing around digital literacy and inclusion, and what we're doing to sort of move that particular ball down the field, and have some organized and coordinated sessions and conversations around that. So I want to be cognizant of our time, but feel free to put notes in the Google Doc and email as well. And then I'm also going to hang on here. We've got, I think, like a 15-minute window. So I'm going to hang on here for a few more minutes for anybody who wants to open the floor for conversation. But otherwise, thank you all for joining today. I hope this has helped us start to think strategically and what OTESSA in particular might be able to do. Valerie and I even talked about, maybe we start like proposing for some funding to bring in through OTESSA. We could funnel that out to folks and say, okay, for those of you who are working on challenge X, here's some funding for that. Challenge Y, here's some funding for that. So I think we can think very strategically about that. Thanks for joining for a conversation.